The black dress hanging in my closet had seen better days, but it was the best I could afford. At 48, sitting in the corner of the grand ballroom at the Meridian Hotel, I watched my former colleagues celebrate the 20th anniversary of the tech company I'd helped build from nothing. "Did you see what Margaret wore?" The whisper carried across the table like poison, followed by barely suppressed laughter. "I mean, I know she's been struggling since the layoffs, but couldn't she have found something more appropriate for tonight?" The comment came from Jessica, the new VP of marketing who'd taken over my department after the restructuring that had eliminated my position 6 months ago. She was 28, wore designer everything, and had never known what it felt like to choose between paying rent and buying a dress for a company event you'd been invited to out of pity. I smoothed the fabric of my 5-year-old dress and tried to ignore the stares and whispers. The invitation had been a surprise, a courtesy extended to founding employees, though most of my contemporaries had either been forced out or had left voluntarily when the new management took over. I'd almost declined, but something stubborn in me refused to be erased from the story of a company I'd poured 15 years of my life into building. What I didn't know was that Marcus, the 22-year-old waiter serving our table, had been listening to every cruel comment, and he was about to remind everyone exactly who they were talking about. The months leading up to this anniversary dinner had been a masterclass in corporate gaslighting disguised as modernization. When Techflow Solutions was acquired by a larger firm, the new leadership had promised to honor the company's legacy while bringing fresh energy to the organization. What they'd actually done was systematically eliminate anyone over 40, replacing experienced employees with younger, cheaper alternatives. I'd been one of the first to go, despite being the employee who designed the customer service protocols that had made the company profitable. "We're moving in a different direction," the new CEO had explained, his 20-something face earnest with practiced sincerity. "We need people who understand the digital native mindset." The irony was devastating. I'd been coding before most of these digital natives were born. I'd built the systems they were now claiming credit for improving. But in the new corporate culture, experience was seen as a liability, wisdom as outdated thinking, and anyone who remembered how things used to work was considered a threat to innovation. The layoffs had been brutal but efficient. One by one, the founding employees disappeared, replaced by recent graduates who worked for half the salary and didn't question decisions that made no sense to anyone who understood the company's history. Within 6 months, the institutional knowledge of 15 years had been erased, replaced by buzzwords and trendy management theories. I'd struggled to find new employment, discovering that being a 48-year-old woman in tech was like being a ghost, visible enough to be rejected, invisible enough to be ignored. Younger hiring managers looked at my resume with polite disinterest, their eyes glazing over when I mentioned experience with systems they'd never heard of but still relied on. The invitation to tonight's anniversary dinner had felt like salt in the wound. "We'd love to have our founding team members join us as we celebrate 20 years of innovation," the elegant card had read. But looking around the ballroom, I could see that very few of the founding team had actually been invited. Most of the faces were new, young, unfamiliar. I was a token, a museum piece brought out to add legitimacy to a celebration of a company that no longer existed. The evening's program began with the usual corporate theater speeches about innovation, growth, and the bright future ahead. The new CEO, Brandon Mitchell, took the stage with the confident swagger of someone who'd never had to build anything from scratch, only inherit and rebrand. 20 years ago, he announced to the packed ballroom, a small group of visionaries had a dream. Tonight, we celebrate how that dream has evolved into the cutting-edge company we are today. I listened as he recounted the company's history, carefully edited to minimize the contributions of the people who'd actually built it. The late nights spent debugging code, the customer crises we'd solved with creativity and determination, the financial struggles we'd weathered through sheer persistence, all of it sanitized into a neat narrative of inevitable success. My name wasn't mentioned once, despite the fact that the customer retention system he praised as revolutionary was something I'd designed in my living room during the company's second year. The protocols that had saved the company during the 2008 recession were attributed to innovative thinking without acknowledging who had actually done the thinking. Fashion disaster at table 12. I heard Jessica whisper to her companion, loud enough for half the table to hear. I mean, I feel bad for Margaret, but showing up looking like that is just embarrassing for everyone. The laughter that followed was quiet but cutting. I felt my cheeks burn with humiliation, my hands trembling as I reached for my water glass. This was what I'd been reduced to, an object of pity and mockery, a cautionary tale about what happened when you got left behind by progress. But then I noticed something that made me pause. Marcus, the young waiter who'd been serving our table, had stopped refilling water glasses. He was standing perfectly still, his face flushed with what looked like anger, his eyes fixed on Jessica with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. "Excuse me," he said suddenly, his voice cutting through the ambient chatter. "I'm sorry, but I couldn't help overhearing your conversation." The table fell silent, all eyes turning to this young man who'd just interrupted their private mockery. Watching Marcus stand there with righteous anger blazing in his young eyes, I felt a complex mix of emotions churning in my chest. Part of me was mortified that my humiliation had become so obvious that even the waitstaff had noticed. The last thing I wanted was to be seen as a victim, someone so pathetic that strangers felt compelled to defend me. But another part of me, the part that had been silent for too long, was grateful that someone, anyone, had witnessed what was happening and found it unacceptable. For months, I'd been questioning my own worth, wondering if the new management was right, if I really had become obsolete, a relic of an outdated way of doing business. The systematic erasure of my contributions had worked its way into my psyche like a slow poison. When you're told repeatedly that your experience is irrelevant, that your methods are outdated, that your presence is no longer needed, you start to believe it. I'd begun to see myself through their eyes as a woman who'd failed to adapt, who'd been left behind by progress, who deserved whatever dismissal came her way. Sitting in that ballroom, wearing a dress that marked me as someone who couldn't afford to keep up with corporate expectations, I felt every year of my 48 years weighing on my shoulders. Every choice I'd made, every sacrifice I'd offered to build this company seemed suddenly foolish and naive. Maybe they were right. Maybe I was just a relic. But Marcus's anger told a different story. This young man, who couldn't have been much older than 22, had seen something in the situation that the executives and managers had missed. He'd recognized an injustice that the people with power and authority had either ignored or actively participated in. His willingness to speak up, to risk his job to defend someone he barely knew, reminded me of something I'd forgotten: that worth isn't determined by age or fashion sense or corporate politics. It's determined by the value you create, the problems you solve, the contributions you make. And I had made contributions, significant ones, whether they chose to remember them or not. Marcus set down his water pitcher with deliberate care, his movements precise despite the emotion clearly building in his chest. The conversation at our table had stopped entirely, everyone staring at this young waiter who'd just inserted himself into their private mockery. "I'm sorry," Jessica said, her voice dripping with condescension, "but this is a private conversation. Perhaps you could focus on your job." But Marcus wasn't backing down. If anything, he seemed to grow taller, more confident with each passing second. "Actually, ma'am, I think this is exactly about my job, and about this company, and about respect." The tension at the table was palpable. Other guests were beginning to notice the commotion, conversations quieting as people sensed drama unfolding. Jessica's face had gone from amused to annoyed to genuinely concerned as she realized this wasn't going to be easily dismissed. "Young man," she said, her voice taking on the authoritative tone she used in board meetings, "I don't know what you think you heard, but I heard you mocking a woman's appearance." Marcus interrupted, his voice clear and strong. "I heard you laughing about someone who's struggling financially, and I heard you doing it about Margaret Collins." The use of my full name sent a shock through the table. How did this young waiter know who I was? I'd never seen him before tonight, had no connection to him that I could think of. "Do you know who Margaret Collins is?" Marcus continued, his voice growing stronger as he addressed not just Jessica but the entire table. "Do any of you actually know who you're talking about?" Jessica looked confused and increasingly uncomfortable. "I don't see how that's relevant." "It's relevant because you're sitting in a building that exists because of her work," Marcus said, his voice now carrying across the surrounding tables. "You're celebrating a company that she helped build from nothing, and you're mocking her because she can't afford a new dress after you fired her." The silence that followed was deafening. Other conversations in the ballroom had stopped as people turned to watch this unexpected confrontation. Even the speakers on stage seemed to have paused, sensing that something significant was happening in the audience. "I think you're mistaken," Jessica said weakly, but her voice lacked conviction. "No," Marcus replied, his young face set with determination. "I think you are, and I think it's time someone reminded you who you're really talking about." What happened next would be talked about in tech circles for months to come. Marcus didn't just defend me, he educated an entire ballroom about who I really was and what I'd accomplished. And he did it with a knowledge that stunned everyone, including me. "Margaret Collins," he announced, his voice now carrying clearly across the ballroom, "designed the customer service architecture that this company still uses today. She created the retention protocols that kept TechFlow profitable during the 2008 recession when half your competitors went under." The room had gone completely silent. Even the speakers on stage had stopped mid-sentence, realizing that something extraordinary was happening in the audience. "She worked 18-hour days during the company's first 5 years," Marcus continued, his voice growing stronger with each revelation. "She mortgaged her house to help fund the expansion into the West Coast market. She trained every customer service representative this company hired for the first decade of its existence." I stared at him in shock. How could this young man know details about my work that even my former colleagues had forgotten? Details that weren't in any company literature or public records. When the servers crashed during the Black Friday sale in 2015, Marcus's voice rang with authority. Margaret was the one who stayed up for 3 straight days rebuilding the system. The sale that saved the company that year, that was her work. Jessica had gone pale. Her earlier confidence completely evaporated. Around the ballroom, I could see executives and managers shifting uncomfortably as they realized the scope of what was being revealed. "She wrote the code that processes your transactions," Marcus continued, turning to address the entire room. "She designed the user interface that made your platform accessible to millions of customers. She created the training programs that taught your employees how to actually help people instead of just selling to them." He paused, letting his words sink in before delivering the most devastating revelation of all. "And 6 months ago, you fired her in a restructuring that eliminated everyone who actually knew how this company worked. You replaced institutional knowledge with buzzwords, experience with enthusiasm, and wisdom with youth." The silence was absolute. 300 people holding their breath as this young waiter dismantled years of corporate revisionist history. "So when you mock her dress," Marcus said, his voice dropping to an intimate level that somehow carried to every corner of the room, "when you laugh about her financial struggles, when you treat her like she's irrelevant, you're not just being cruel to a person. You're being cruel to the woman who built the foundation you're standing on." He turned to look directly at Jessica, then at the other executives scattered throughout the room. "My question is this," he said, his young voice carrying the weight of absolute moral authority. "Why are you trying to silence the woman who built this company? Why are you erasing the contributions of the person who made your success possible?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, demanding an answer that no one in that room was prepared to give. "Because that's what you're doing," Marcus concluded. "You're not just firing employees. You're erasing history. And that's not innovation. That's vandalism." The aftermath of Marcus's speech was immediate and profound. The ballroom erupted in whispered conversations as people processed what they'd just heard. Some executives looked shocked, others embarrassed, and a few appeared to be frantically making phone calls, probably to their assistants, probably about damage control. But the most significant reaction came from an unexpected source. Dr. Patricia Wong, the company's original co-founder, who'd been largely sidelined by the new management, stood up from her table and began walking toward me. She was followed by several other original employees who'd somehow managed to survive the purges. "Margaret," Dr. Wong said as she reached my table, her voice thick with emotion, "I owe you an apology." "We all do." What followed was a reunion. I'd never expected original team members sharing stories about my contributions, acknowledging work that had been forgotten or misattributed, recognizing sacrifices that had been overlooked in the rush toward modernization. But the most surprising moment came when Marcus approached me during the chaos, his waiter's uniform somehow making him look more dignified than any of the executives in their expensive suits. "How did you know all that?" I asked, still stunned by the depth of his knowledge about my work. He smiled, and for the first time that evening, looked his age. "My mom," he said simply. "She's been in customer service here for 8 years. She's told me stories about the woman who trained her, who created the systems that made her job possible, who fought for employee benefits and fair treatment." The revelation hit me like lightning. "Your mother is Linda Rodriguez," he said proudly, "and she's been waiting for someone to tell the truth about what really happened to the people who built this place." That night, I learned that sometimes the most powerful advocacy comes from the most unexpected sources. Sometimes it takes someone with nothing to lose to speak the truth that everyone else is too afraid to voice. And sometimes, the people who see your worth most clearly are the ones who've inherited the legacy of your work, even if they've never met you. Marcus hadn't just offended me, he'd reminded an entire industry what happens when you erase the people who built your foundation. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been made to feel obsolete or irrelevant because of your age, remember this: your contributions don't disappear just because someone chooses not to acknowledge them. The systems you built, the people you trained, the problems you solved, these create ripples that extend far beyond your immediate recognition. Share this story with someone who needs to remember their own lasting impact today. Subscribe for more stories about women whose worth transcends corporate politics and whose legacies live on in the work they've done and the people they've touched. Because every woman who has built something meaningful deserves to have her contributions remembered and honored. Sometimes the most powerful moment in our lives is when someone unexpected reminds the world of the value we've always had.